Hey guys, it's Ornlu, and we are back with another tier list video, and this is going to be a topic I haven't done in 4 years, back when my hair was extremely questionable, and that is going to be all about unique units. So it has been a long time. This is, I believe, just post Lords of the West. So we now have 50 civilizations in the game instead of the 33, I think, that existed back then. So another 17 civs, tons and tons of balance patches. So this feels like an appropriate time to revisit this list. I actually had to make this one myself because there wasn't even one that was updated on Tier Maker. So this now has 78 unique units in AoE2, according to the game, which is obviously quite a lot. I'll try and go through this list as quickly as possible, but we'll have to go ahead and see how this one goes. So definitely leave a comment as to what your favorite or least favorite unique units are, where you think they can see play, where you think they should be able to see play, and of course, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe and all of that good stuff. So, with that in mind, the tier list. Unique units are, by their nature, unique, and are often situational, or some civilizations are more defined by their unique units than others. With that context, the way I'm going to rank this is the S tiers unique units are the ones that are one, completely defining of a civilization, in that most late game army compositions revolve around that unique unit, or that the fast castle into unique unit strategy with that civ is one that is very prevalent. You know, the top type tier unique units. A tier unique units are ones that are still very strong, but they might fill a certain niche in a civilization, and it's not the sort of unit that you want to use in like almost all matchups. It's maybe more like 50% of matchups, where it's like, yeah, the unit is very, very good, but not quite at that sort of degree of ubiquity that we see in the S tier civs. B tier unique units are ones that can be very powerful. I mean, there aren't really any units in AoE2 that are completely awful, right? But the B tier unique units might just be slightly better versions of existing units without really filling a unique niche, so to say. Ones that you can see as a late game unit occasionally, but it's not one you're ever going to fast castle into. And yeah, units that are good, but not necessarily as defining. C tier unique units are ones that we're getting to be very situational. They're, again, every unique unit can find a situation where they are good. So it's not like these units are terrible, but the situations in which you want to make them perhaps come up quite rarely, because either they are too niche or because they are not powerful enough, basically. D tier, I don't even know if I'm going to use, but units that whose situation is so niche that there really isn't that much of a reason to ever use them. With that in mind, I have organized all these unique units by alphabetically. So I got Arambai all the way down to the Shenbei Raider. And let's get this going with the Arambai. Arambai are very good. In many ways, they are defining of the Burmese civilization. I don't think they're S tier. They're probably going to be at the top of A tier. Yes, you can fast castle Arambai. Yes, they can be the cornerstone of a late game army composition, but Burmese are often very happy just going for a pure monk strategy or monk siege, and it's not necessary to go for the Arambai in a lot of situations. That said, this unit is absolutely terrifying when massed, so it's, if not quite S tier, it'll probably be around the top of A tier. Ballista Elephants. So this unit, again, I don't think we can quite consider it S tier because it's not one that you can use all the time with Khmer, and in fact, on open maps, you generally don't see Ballista Elephants at all. That said, in a lot of situations, it's just a matter of, can the Khmer player mass a bunch of this unit, and if they do, they win the video game. I think that maybe lower down on A tier is going to be appropriate. Also, let's make this larger. Berserks, as much as I love them, are probably just a C tier unique unit. They are upgrades of the champions if you can get them going, but Vikings are typically playing a more low eco style or mostly playing water maps. It's just not really a unit that is super important to the Vikings in some situations, but it's definitely not D tier because if you need to go late game with Vikings, this is probably the best unit you can go for, is the Berserk. So yes, they're an upgrade to champions, but not really filling any unique role that champions don't. They're just kind of better champions. Boyars are interesting because they are a really good unit, but they are kind of slow to get going. Like, they are basically straight up upgrades of Cavalier, but they just aren't a super important unit to the Slavs in a lot of cases. Now, because of Datinets, which can make your castles cheaper on the stone cost, it can be easier to make these guys in late game than you might think. but really they're just super strong, heavy cavalry. You don't get paladins, so there's no direct competition there. Boyars are basically an upgrade of Cavalier in most ways, except for movement speed. I like Boyars, they're fun, but I would put them even behind Berserks in that late game for Slavs is typically more dominated by infantry and siege. Camel Archer is S tier easy, one of the best unique units in the entire game. They're so central to the Berbers and their late game strength. They're easy to keep alive, especially with the HP regeneration of Maghreb camels. They're good against almost everything once you get enough of them and enough upgrades. They are a bit slow to get going, especially in the context that Berbers themselves are not a fast civilization right off the bat. But I don't know if they're the best unique unit in the game. There's going to be quite a few good contenders in here, but they're one of the very best units in all of AoE2. It's very tough to stop a big blob of Camel Archers in both 1v1s and in team games, and you can certainly FC into them. Sao. Yes, the hero units are technically unique units in the game. D tier. The thing with all of the hero units, spoilers, I'm going to put all the heroes in D tier. They are so expensive. They're 500 food, 500 gold, that they're simply not worth making in an even game. They just don't provide enough value. Sao in particular increases the attack speed of nearby units by, I think, 11%, which is, okay, but 1,000 resources and especially 500 gold is a lot in the late game. So if you already are, near max pop with a huge bank, then yeah, sure, add in Sao. It's probably worthwhile. But if you're in a max pop situation with a ton of resources, aren't you probably winning the game already at that point? And yeah, I have never once seen in my own games or in pro games a hero unit be the determining factor as to if you win or lose. That said, Sao is, I think, even the worst of the heroes, as the attack speed bonus is less useful than Liu Bei and Sun Jian's abilities. Caravels I will put in D tier as well. They are really good in a super specific situation, which is your Portuguese late game, and you're against a civ like Vikings, where they just don't have fire ships, and Caravels in late game in mass are very, very good against groups of ships. That said, they are countered so hard by fire ships because they don't have as much bonus damage against other warships that the galley line does, that most of the time with Portuguese, you're probably wanting to go galleons anyway, or fire ships in the late game, or, anything else. So Caravels, there is a niche where they are exceptionally good. Any civ that has fast fire ships in the late game, you probably don't want to make Caravels against at all. And spoiler alert, most good naval civs in the late game have fast fire ships as an option. Vikings are obviously the big exception. Armenians as well don't have fast fire ship, and Portuguese themselves. But by and large, fire ships are there. Camel Scouts. This is an interesting one because it just got buffed. It got triple buffed. It now has more attack, and it trains faster. And I guess Gurjara is the extra food you get early on isn't a direct buff, but it's nice. I'm going to put this as a B tier unit, but it's probably going to be pretty high in B tier. Camel Scouts are very good against enemy scout cavalry. And they're even, now that they have 5 attack, they're basically as good against generic units as the scout cavalry as well. The downside is that they are still very expensive to get going, costing 55 food, 60 gold like a regular camel. And there are maps where the Camel Scout isn't going to be as useful, like Arena, where they don't have any conversion resistance, so they can be converted by monks very easily and represent actually a lot of value to get converted. So in that sense, they don't quite fill the same role as the scout cavalry. They are a very good unit, and we see Gurjaras a lot more these days, but I think upper B tier feels fine for the Camel Scout. Cataphracts are probably going to be... we can move stuff around later if we really want to. Probably top of B tier or close to the top of B tier. It's almost a very binary. If your opponent's making infantry, make Cataphracts, and then they'll kill all the infantry and be one of the best units in the game at doing so. If your opponent isn't making a lot of infantry, you don't really have much reason to ever go for them. Cataphracts really are an anti-infantry unit. They are also kind of your best power unit as the Byzantines, but in a world where we don't see infantry as much as we see cavalry and archers and then gunpowder, Cataphracts are not the go-to end-all be-all unit in many situations. Now, obviously, you still see a lot of infantry through various civilizations throughout the game on many different map types. So Cataphracts are still very, very good, don't get me wrong, and that trample damage is awesome, but I really don't see the unit being as important to the late game identity as, say, these 3 are, and especially not really a fast castle into unique unit strategy for Byzantines either. Centurions are probably D tier. I'm going to put him above Sao because he basically does the same thing as Sao, except he's way cheaper to get going. Centurions are way too expensive to make in almost every situation with the Romans, The aura buff can be nice if you're going for swordsman, although that isn't all that common with Romans either, who mostly want to go for like cavalier, halberdiers, and scorpions. So Centurions very, very rarely see play. They're just so expensive. They're what, 75 food, 85 gold, or something insane like that. Like, they are good units, but the playstyle of Romans is typically to use your very strong eco to just vomit out as many units as possible, and the Centurions don't really play into that all that effectively. It's just not a unit that I really see being very effective, even in like team games, where Romans typically want to be making infantry anyway. Overall, not a very good unit. Chakram throwers, I'm going to be putting in A tier. In some ways, they're like cataphracts in that they're both anti-infantry units, but unlike the Cataphract, Chakrams are also kind of your go-to backline DPS unit with the Gurjaras, and they can be absolutely horrifying to play against any sort of clumped up units, whether that be infantry or archers. Maybe like you could say that these two units are kind of similar in that they're situational, but they're incredibly powerful in that situation. But I also think that Chakrams are just a super important part of the Gurjara late game, as it's really the only thing they have that's going to be especially good against infantry. I mean, you do have hand cannoneers as well, but they're not quite as good, whereas Byzantines at least also have fully upgraded arbalests, and also hand cannons as well. So I would say the difference between these two unique units is pretty low, but I'd still say like Chakrams are probably the bottom of A tier, and the Cataphracts are probably the top of B tier. No. Probably B tier here. They're really strong, and they're basically your default late game option with Chinese, but they are a little bit tough to tech into, especially now that the elite upgrade is very expensive, and we don't actually see them all that much, just because Chinese are more of an aggressive civ than a full-blown post-imp civ, wherein they're still weak to all of the things that archers are weak against, like siege. So yeah, still a very strong unit is the Chu-Composite. You still want them in a lot of late game scenarios, so I do think that they're more powerful than Berserks in general. They're also easier to tech into because they are a ranged unit, but not quite as important as some of these other units in the general Chinese strategy, which is generally more aggressive and mid-game focused. So yeah, I mean, we definitely see more Camel Scout production in games than we see in Gurjara games and Chu-Composite production in Chinese games. Composite Bowman, probably top of B tier, bottom of B tier. Let's put them at the bottom of B tier because they do fill a role in the Armenian army in that they don't have another good ranged support unit, as their archer line isn't that great, and their siege isn't that great. And Composite Bowmen can deal a lot of damage, thanks to their armor-piercing ability. That said, they're not necessarily the most important unit for Armenians in the late game, who typically go for the champion spam, and then maybe some monk support. The Composite Bowmen, they can be very good. Like, most of these unique units are probably very good when spammed in the late game. The issue is that, one, how good is it relative to other unique units? And two, how good is it relative to other options the civilization has? And Composite Bowmen are actually pretty easy to get going as well, because like the Chu-Composite, they are a cheap ranged unit, so you can just kind of mix them in to support your army pretty effectively. Yeah, I think bottom of B tier for now is a good spot. Hondos. Ooh, boy. Are they S tier? That doesn't feel quite right. I'm going to put them at the top of A tier. Condos are really interesting because they're such a unique unit, right? They're a team bonus unique unit, but unlike the Genitours and the Imperial Skirmishers, Condos are very, very strong when made by plenty of different teammates because you just hit Imperial Age, they are a fast unit, you can get them going without any additional upgrades, and they're very good against gunpowder, which is one of the most common types of early Imperial Age units. They're great with Italians, and they're such a strong unit that other infantry civilizations like Japanese, Malians, Goths, Vikings, they can make very good use of condos in the way that we just don't really see with Genitours and Imp Skirms, which are more useful in 1v1s, generally speaking, than in team games. Especially Genitours, more of a 1v1 unit. I don't quite think they're S tier because their utility does fall off over the course of a long game, but from early to mid-Imperial Age in both 1v1s and team games on plenty of different map types, condos can be a very powerful option. Oh geez, we're 18 minutes into the recording already! Oh no! Conks S tier. Probably not... probably not quite Camel Archer. Actually, they might even be better than Camel Archers just because Spanish are conquistadors. That is the defining aspect of Spanish all the way until Imperial Age. And that's fine, you know, it's... Not every civilization needs to have a unique unit that's like the centerpiece of their whole design. That is the case with conquistadors, though, and it is just such a powerful unit. Like, conks can find a way in so many situations. They do fall off in Imperial Age relative to how good they are in mid-game, but even so, they are still pretty good in Imperial Age as well. So Camel Archers have probably a higher ceiling than Conquistadors do, but Conquistadors are just so strong right out the bat that it's very difficult to argue against Conks in many, many situations, and Conks alone are one of the reasons that Spanish are picked on a lot of different maps. So for now, they are going to be at the very top. Coustillier, yeah, probably at the bottom of C tier. Not that the unit is bad. It is nice. It's cheap to get out, and it's great at sniping high impact units with the charge attack. The issue is that it's difficult to justify going Coustillier most of the time with Burgundians relative to the Paladins, because the Paladins are so much easier to get going. You get Cavalier and Castle Age, you get the half-cost Paladin upgrade, and so most of the times you have Paladins, which are the better full-blown post-imp unit, and the easier unit to tech into, so it's sometimes difficult to justify making Coustillier, unless it's like a full-on castle drop scenario. It's not a bad unit. And in the long run, it's probably more gold efficient than the Paladins as well, as they cost 20 less gold. But most of the time when you see Burgundians played, it is for the Paladin line, and that's not without good reason. Dragon ships. It's new to the game, right? So it's a little hard to track necessarily. Okay, I'm gonna put them here. Yeah. So the thing with dragon ships is they're super fast fire ships. They're like the best fast fire ships in the game, even better than Byzantines. That said, Chinese themselves aren't... I mean, they have a really good late-game tech tree on the water for Chinese, but they're just not the fastest civ, and speed is almost always the most important thing on a water map. So I do think that the dragon ships, like, they're really good fast fire ships. They're still countered by demo ships and other, like, really, really strong galleons, so it's not, like, the best unit in the world, but dragon ships are still really strong in their given role. Actually, the thing is, they don't do anything that fast fire ships don't, they just do it better. Which I guess is more in line of what the Berserks do, actually, now that I think about it. But I guess it's just fast fire ships are so common in late game, whereas these units aren't really as common. So I think I'm going to put it at the bottom of B tier, now that I think about it more. It's kind of an odd unit, and one that I still don't have that much experience with, but it is still an interesting option for Chinese now in the late game. Remember, this just replaces the fast fire ship upgrade, it's not on top of fast fire ship, so it's easier to tech into than you may think. Fire archers, probably top of D tier. There are like very few situations, kind of like caravels, where fire archers will feel very good, which is like you're in a castle war, but you also can't really use petards because the castles are too far apart. They're also not bad at sniping ships either, but fire archers are generally speaking very underwhelming units. They have very long range, but they have a super slow reload time. And because you miss both Thumbring and the last armor upgrade as the Wu, they just don't really hold up very well as combat units in the late game for Wu. So it's like, it's not, the worst unit in the world, but chances are you could probably be doing something better with your resources as the Wu than making fire archers in most cases. Flemish militia. This is kind of an interesting one, because you can make them as sort of a pikeman swordsman hybrid out of the barracks normally now, but we still don't see it all that often. Yes, the unit is insane with Flemish Revolution specifically, as much as I hate that upgrade. So I'm going to put them at the bottom of C tier. Again, the fact that you can make them out of the barracks now is still pretty new and underexplored, because Burgundians are still just not very good on aggressive settings. But it's at least an interesting unit, and the fact that you can often just win the game with them via Flemish Revolution means that they're at least worth considering in quite a few situations. So I think I'm going to put them at the bottom of C tier. The Flaming Camel. Yeah, that seems fair. It's a gimmick unit. It's fine against, like, mass elephants. You really don't want to make them against most anything else. So, like, BF, they actually are a pretty decent unit because you see lots of elephants there. But it's a gimmick unit. It's a bit of a meme unit. I don't think it really tries to be anything too much more than that, which is pretty funny because they're still probably more useful overall than Centurions and Sao. But, yeah, I mean, if you're up against a bunch of elephants or, like, a bunch of cavalry exclusively, make the Flaming Camels. If not, don't make them. It's not a big deal. At least you don't need to get a unique tech to research. You don't need to research a unique tech to make them anymore. You can just make them out of the Siege Workshop in Imperial Age. Gbetos. Ooh. I think I'm going to put them right here in A tier. They're a really strong ranged support unit, but also quite fragile. They're also the best ranged support unit that Malians have, which in some ways makes them like the Arambai, because you can go FC into Gbetos, and it can be very strong, but they are still quite flimsy. Late game, again, they can be very powerful, but you can still get jumped by heavy cavalry or lots of archers. So it's a bit of a tricky unit to use, but nevertheless a super powerful one, and one of the reasons that Malians can be so deadly on maps like Nomad, where you can like fight for water early on, drop the castle, and then you can just go for Gbetos, and they are a very scary unit. Scary but flimsy. It's a tricky matchup. Genitours, oh boy, probably bottom of C tier. They're a pretty situational unit. The situation in which you want to make Genitours arises more often than any of these units, so I think they're still C tier. But it's skirmishers when you don't have skirmishers left over from Feudal Age, and you kind of just want to make that transition later on in the game. If you have any amount of gold, you usually want to make Camel Archers, though, which are kind of just better. It's a bit of an awkward unit within the Berber tech tree, but it's not bad. It is still a very strong unit in the right circumstances. You have to be careful against Halbs, though. Yeah, it's situationally very good, but not really the best unit in the world. Also, look at how even this development is so far, man. I did not plan this all out ahead of time. Genoese crossbowmen. Ooh. Funnily enough, they're kind of like ballista elephants, but you can't get them going much easier than ballista elephants can. So I'm going to put them right there, I think. Like, this unit defines the Italian late game because it's just such a well-rounded unit. Like, on the one hand, they're like arbs in many ways, but they also counter one of the biggest weaknesses of archers in general, which is cavalry. And this unit alone makes a lot of matchups very difficult against Italians in the late game for civilizations that just rely on cavalry. It's a much slower unit to get going than a Rombai or Gbetos, and definitely Condos, but it's still a very powerful unit. It's a fun unit to play with, and it's certainly it's the centerpiece of the Italian late game in most situations. Really strong unit, but I don't think it's quite S tier. They are still weak to skirmishers, which are a trash unit and also the most common unit in the game, but overall still a very powerful unit, and much easier to get. It's a much easier death ball unit to get going than ballista elephants are. Gulams. Yeah, I think B tier is fine. Maybe behind the Cataphract. Gulams you make versus archers. If you're not facing archers explicitly, don't make them. It's just kind of how Hindustanis are, right? With, you have imp camels against cavalry, Gulams against archers, and then hand cannoneers against infantry. And those are sort of the core late game units that you want to dance around. That sort of puts Gulam in a similar space to the Chakrams and the Cataphracts, but I also think that the Chakrams and Cataphracts are much easier to make sort of the centerpiece of your late game army than are Gulams, which are still going to die to most of the things that kill infantry, except archers. So Gulams, it's funny because they make the matchups versus like Mayans absolutely dreadful, but most of the time you can find an answer to Gulams, unless your opponent is just way too stuck going archers. It's still a good unit, though, in a lot of settings. Like, Gulams are strong, don't get me wrong, but not quite at the level of these other ones. Grenadiers, oh boy. Again, it's a new unit that we're still kind of coming to grips with. Maybe here? I don't know. It feels like you could put them anywhere in A tier and they'd probably be okay. They can be very fast to get going after a quick fast castle. They're good against most feudal age units. They are very bad though against things like cav archers, and they're not great versus heavy cav either, especially as players' economies start to grow. But then suddenly in post-imp, the unit becomes amazing again with thunderclap bombs. So it's like they're really good in early castle age, then they have a big dip, and then they become amazing again in late game. So it's still a little bit awkward, and I think we as a community haven't really fully figured out the unit yet and all of its different interactions. Like, for a while, it's like the unit wasn't made at all, and then it got triple buffed, I think, and then you had the popular FC Grenadiers build, which is really annoying to deal with, and the unit that's then going to fall off again afterwards, though. So yeah, it's a tricky unit to place right now. Hofnitsa S tier. If we're looking at like what is the best post-imp unit, it literally is probably the best post-imp unit in the game. But I think overall, you still need to be an Imperial Age with at least a decently sized eco to get Hofnitsa. They are the reason Bohemians are so broken in the late game against so many civilizations. And it's just, there is almost no way for most civs to deal with Hofnitsa with some sort of infantry support. Probably Halbs. It's just better than a bombard cannon in almost every way. Literally in every way, except, the ways in which they're even. Better blast radius, more damage, higher HP, higher pierce armor, faster movement speed with Wagenborg tactics, better blast radius. It is almost the perfect late game siege unit. It's so hard to micro against, and it's almost like the Bohemian player is just playing solitaire at that point in the game. I'm putting it still behind these two because it is still just a post-imp unit, but it is also probably the best post-imp unit in the game, so terrifying unit. Huskies! Yeah, they're probably also S tier. Probably lower in S tier, but Goths are in so many ways defined by the Huskarl, the infantry unit that is good against ranged units. Yes, they die to infantry in a heavy cav, but Goths usually just sort of they just complement the Goths so well, right? It fills a super necessary hole in the tech tree, which is archers, or rather dealing with archers. And they're amazing at raiding. You can mass produce them from barracks in late game. And it's just, you can't talk about Goths without talking about Huskarls. You can talk about Tatars without ever mentioning the Flaming Camel, and you'll still get a reasonable, understanding of how the unit is played. You know what I mean? It still has its big weaknesses, so I don't think it's quite up here with, these units, but it's still just such an important unit for the Goths. Hussite wagons, oh boy. It's a unit that's really good in early Castle Age, but it's usually really bad in late game. That said, it's so good in early Castle Age that I'm going to put it at the bottom of A tier, maybe. Because if a unit is going to be really good early on and very bad later on, that's okay, because if it's really good early on, then usually you don't have to get to later on. That said, it's not that important for Bohemians, which just goes to show how insane Bohemians are. I mean, it's again, they're so underwhelming in the late game since they die really hard to siege and heavy cavalry. Okay, I'm going to put them here, but it's just so awkward, right? Because if we're talking Castle Age, we're like near the top of S tier, and if we're talking about Imperial Age, we're like down in D tier. So I guess, somewhere in the middle of B tier is a pretty good spot for it overall. But it's just such a weird, janky unit. Imperial Camels, the Hindustani Imp Camel. It's definitely right here with Gulams, Cataphracts, Chakrams, in that they're really, really good at what you want them to do, but you just don't need to make them in any other situation. Like, if you're against cavalry, Imp Camels are one of the best units in AoE2 to deal with cavalry. If you're not against cavalry, then you never make them. So, but they still form sort of the core of the Hindustani late game in a lot of situations. So I'm just going to put them at the top of B tier. But I still think Chakrams get the edge for, like, the really strong but also kind of niche units, because Chakrams are good against both massed infantry and massed archers. But yeah, it's all pretty close between these units. Imperial Skirmishers. If Skirmishers are the best unit in AoE2 and Imp Skirmishers are the best Skirmishers, top of S tier. Easy peasy. No, in all seriousness, I do think they are a very good unit, though, because they actually can see play in team games, because now compared to the 4 times, trade is actually kind of harder to get up and running. Players are so good at punishing. That said, the Imp Skirm also has its role largely overlapping with Rattan archers, so it's a really tough comparison to make. I think I'm going to put them here. I mean, Imp Skirms, they're really good. They're like the best skirms in the game. And yet they're still skirmishers. So they're not really going to win you a lot of late game matchups in some situations. But low gold situations, they're also really, really good. Also, it's only an Imperial Age unit. It doesn't exist in Castle Age. Yeah, I think here is fine. It's a tough unit to rank. The Iron Pagoda. This is definitely a C tier unit. If you're looking for a pop-efficient cavalry unit in late game, then the Iron Pagoda is going to be your bet. So actually, in kind of some ways, it's like Berserks, in that their role is generally not one that's needed, but if you're in the situation where you need it, it is still an important tool, right? It is your pop-efficient heavy cav unit, and they are still pretty good in that role. That said, Jurchens have a lot of other really strong late game options, kind of like Slavs with Boyars, and I think Boyars are still probably a bit better. So maybe somewhere around here, because there is no other heavy cav option for the Jurchens. It's just Jurchens have lots of other very strong options with Step Lancers and Grenadiers and Rocket Carts and Hussars and all that stuff. Even cav archers can work sometimes. So yeah, somewhere around here feels pretty fair. Jags. Okay. I mean, back in the day, I would have put them low C tier. Now they're just such a good all-around unit that it feels like the default late-game option for Aztecs, as their damage is just ridiculous. So it's not like you need them all the time, and they don't necessarily jive with the Aztec playstyle, which is much more aggressive. So it feels like somewhere around here would make a lot of sense for Jaguars, because it's a really strong unit. It still dies to archers. It's like a really powerful unit, but still kind of situational. They're pretty cool now, though. I mean, their attack can be ridiculous. Yeah, that seems pretty fine for the Jaguar. Janissaries. They've been superseded by cav archer play a lot. That said, Janissaries can still be really scary, but they're a lot more situational than they used to be. Because in late game, you'd rather just have cav archers most of the time. Yeah, I think this is a pretty fair spot for the Janissary. Again, it's a little bit awkward because they can be so powerful in certain situations, but it just right now, given the current balance of the game, it feels like you'd just rather have cav archers most of the time. But like the super low eco push, Janissaries still absolutely have a niche there, and it can be very tough to stop. Qian Swordsman, oh jeez. Even after their nerf, they're still probably S tier. Are they S tier? Thing is, they're so bad in late game, but they also completely define the mid game of WoW. And we'll put them at the top of A tier. I mean, just early Castle Age, these units are a menace to deal with. They easily crush all Feudal Age units. They can sit under TC fire. They easily kill villagers. And to deal with them, you need heavy cavalry or lots of infantry. Heavy cav can get countered by a couple monks, and infantry take a long time to switch into. The only reason I'm not putting them in S tier is that they are just so bad in late game because their stats really fall off. Since you only get 2 more attack in Imperial Age, you get no other stat boosts. And the, 45, 50 gold cost is really, really inhibitive for a late game unit. So it's another odd one. It's so unfun to play against in mid game, but is also just not very important in the late game at all for the WoW. That seems pretty fair. Kameyuks feel like they're in the club of, yeah, they're good against cavalry, but you don't need to make them all the time. That said, kind of like Chakrams, they have a role beyond their specific counter unit role. Because a blob of Kameyuks is good against most anything melee, even if they're still vulnerable to ranged attacks. Do you want Kameyuks a lot of the time? Not necessarily, but it's still a really freaking good unit. And in mass, it can be one of the tougher units to stop, especially if you don't have good ranged options. So I think this feels pretty fair at the bottom of A tier. Still situational, but kind of like the Chakram, it feels like there are more situations in which they are good compared to perhaps these guys. Karambits! If they belong to a civ other than melee, they'd be really bad, but with the melee eco, timing advantage, and free armor upgrades, the unit's really, really good. So, like, you just see them all the time as melee. They're your infantry option to make before gold runs out, because you don't really want to make your swordsman until gold runs out. And yet, you don't really need them in a lot of situations with melee, so maybe here, maybe somewhere around here is fine. They're really, really good. Especially because you can go for them on low eco or on high eco, depending on the situation. They do have their counters, of course, heavy cavalry, archers, hand cannons, all that stuff. But again, it's Karambits existing in the context of all the other bonuses with melee, with the free armor upgrades and the age up advancement bonus. That's just so, so powerful for this unit. Keshiks. Keshiks are, like, really good, but they're also just not the most important thing in the world for Tatars. I think they're definitely more useful overall than Boyars, Iron Pagodas, or Coustillier. Berserks are still probably more important overall to the Vikings, though, than Keshiks are to the Tatars, who have Steppe Lancers that can fill a similar role and are a bit easier to get going. That said, Keshiks do represent really good cost efficiency. They're a great rating unit, they're great against archers, and just decent all around, on top of the whole gold generation mechanic. So it's a good unit, but not one that really defines the Tatars in a super meaningful way. Kippers! Just kidding, they're Kipchaks. Again, it's kind of like Karambits. They're really good in general only because they exist with humans and their insane eco and timing potential. They really fall off a cliff in late game, and for that reason, I'm going to put them here. They're still better than Hussite wagons in the late game, although they're not quite as strong as Hussite wagons at the start. And they are still important because they're the best ranged support unit you have as the humans. But the unit isn't that great, but because the human eco and timings are busted, then the unit is still very, very powerful in a lot of situations. Somewhere around here feels pretty reasonable for the Kippers. Konniks, they're in this C tier class of, yes, it's a very good late game unit, but also it's not super necessary for Bulgarians. But you have Krepos to help get them out, and they really are the Bulgarians' best late game unit. I mean, Konniks are very, very good with full upgrades. It's just a matter of you have to play Bulgarians to make Konniks, which is kind of a downside. But yeah, very good unit. Your best go-to late game unit with the Bulgarians, but still, Bulgarians are usually played in much more aggressive settings anyway, if they're played at all. Legionaries, kind of a similar deal, actually. I think I'm going to put them here. Again, they're a good sort of go-to unit for the Romans, except Romans would rather make Cavalier most of the time because they can also train very fast with committances. I mean, just you'd rather have faster units in general. Because it feels like Romans, as design-wise, you kind of want like this slow, plodding, really efficient army of your Centurions, buffing up your Legionaries and supported by Scorpions. But all of those things die to really good gunpowder and siege civs anyway. So it just doesn't quite jive with the old Romans playstyle, which is much more fast-paced. Which is why you almost always see Cavalier, and then Halb spamming, and then maybe a Scorpion blob in late game as well. If you can avoid the bombard cannons and onagers with it. It is a good unit. Like, all of these C-tier units absolutely have situations where they feel very, very powerful. Which just goes to show that even sort of the more underwhelming unique units are still very powerful in their correct situation. It's just the situation in which you make them isn't quite as common. Leitis, absolutely an S-tier unit. Probably here. Unit is just absolutely insane. It alone carries the Lithuanian late game. It gives them, with relics, some truly unbeatable matchups as they just bulldoze everything in their way. You can make them in mid-game. You very rarely want to go Lithuanian Paladins. I mean, this unit really does define the Lithuanians over the course of the game. I mean, even without relics, it is one of the better unique units. And with relics, it just becomes, nigh unstoppable. As, once you start to 3-hit halbs, then the Leitis is just really, really tough to beat. It still doesn't give you the extreme degree of population efficiency or early castle age advantage that these two units do. But yeah, Leitis absolutely one of the best units in the game. Liao Dao, again, unit that is very powerful as your slow push melee unit, but that's also not what Khitans like doing in a lot of cases. You'd still much rather make Liao Dao than champions in most situations, though, so I think we're gonna put them here. They're still very bad against ranged units, but very strong in melee combat as there is a lot of banging happening. Liu Bei. Like I said, all the heroes are D tier, but Liu Bei, at least, his aura effect of the HP regeneration is very nice with the Shu army, which has a lot of HP with your white feather guards. It's slow. It likes to be in one giant blob. So at least in that sense, Liu Bei works well with the Shu. But again, if you're making Liu Bei, you've probably won the game already or have made a very poor investment. Longboats. Ooh, this is an interesting one. They're definitely a unit that's strong enough to just go FC longboats in certain situations. Late game, they can struggle to be cost efficient relative to galleons, which is why you see Viking players switch back to galleons in late game. But the unit is still really powerful for a very long time in the game. Although the lack of fire ships does make the efficacy of Vikings more limited when it comes to water-type maps. But longboats still play a very important niche in the Viking Navy, and is still your best anti-fire ship unit most of the times. So somewhere around here feels perfectly fine. Longbowmen, definitely in this class of... It is the go-to post-imp unit for Britons, and Britons are much more of a post-imp civ than, say, Chinese or Aztecs are. So I think maybe even putting it over here above the Camel Scout. Because Britain's late game, it is defined by Longbowmen. That said, Longbowmen are basically just better ARBs. There isn't anything super fancy about that, which is fine. They don't need anything fancier. But it's not going to be quite as defining, I think, as some of these other options are. And they're not really... They still have most of the same weaknesses that archers do in general, and they don't solve any Briton problems, so to say, in their tech tree. They're just a better archer. So yeah, still the cornerstone of the Britons in the late game. Can't really talk about Britain late game without Longbowmen, and yet I don't quite think they filled that sort of unique niche, nor are they as oppressive in early game as some of these other units. Magyar-Hussars, just getting triple buffed. I think we can put them somewhere around here. They're still more of a late game unit than a Castle Age unit, so I think maybe around here would be fine. Maybe even a low gold situation. Yeah, I mean, it's it is the best trash unit in the game. Also, you need to get an upgrade to turn it into a trash unit, and in early to mid-Imperial Age, you'd probably rather have the Nightline anyway, especially since you get fully upgraded Paladins. So it's still a little bit awkward of a unit in sort of the space of the Magyar military, but there is certainly no denying that it is just one of the best post-imp low-gold units in AoE2. Mamelukes. S tier easily. Yeah, maybe even up over here. Mamelukes did just get nerfed a little bit, but the thing with Mamelukes is that you can go for... actually, maybe... It's right around the Leitis, for sure. You can go for them with a fast castle into Mamelukes, but they're pretty expensive and easy to convert, so it's not like they're at their best in that role. But it's Mamelukes are a unit that once you get them going, it is just almost impossible to stop them. Very few things in AoE2 trade well against Mamelukes in a large mass. So it is easily an S-tier unit. It is very much the center of the Saracens in the late game. I mean, really, it's late game, you need good camels or good siege, very strong archers or something like that. Or the answers to Mamelukes are few and far between. That is for sure. They're at least relatively balanced, though, with a very high cost. Speaking of late game units, oh boy. Are we going to put Mangudai at number 1? I think we just might. They're not as good in early Castle Age as Conquistadors, and you could certainly argue either Mangudai or Camel Archers in the late game, depending on the situation. That said, Mongols are Mangudai throughout the game. It is their best unit in so many situations. They are very difficult to stop when fully massed. Everyone's known about this for a very long time, so there's no real surprise here. It's just, Mongols are Mangudai. Yes, you also have strong siege options, but it feels like you can win a late game with Berbers without ever making Camel Archers because you also have the cheap stable units and a decent tech tree. Much more so than you can win a late game with Mongols without Mangudai. There are some situations you can do that with like Steppe Lancers plus Siege and like Hussars, but anytime you're making a ranged unit, like an archery range unit, and it's not a Mangudai in late game, you're probably feeling pretty sad about it as a Mongols player. So maybe there's going to be someone else that comes up, but I don't think so. They'll probably end up getting the top spot. Missionaries. I don't know why I said it like that. Missionaries. They're still a little situational, but they are pretty good now. They're pretty tanky with the armor upgrades and husbandry and bloodlines. You still get Sanctity and Fervor. You get Inquisition. They're still a little situational as to, like, do you want monks or do you want missionaries? But they are still a pretty good unit all around. I still think I'm going to put them over here because you're typically not defined by missionaries, unless you go for the amazing donkey rush, but unless you're doing the specific donkey rush, missionaries and monks largely accomplish the same thing. It's just each has their advantages over the other. But considering missionaries spent almost their entire existence as a bottom of D tier unit, this is really just more speaking to how many viable units there are in AoE2, rather than the fact that missionaries are bad, so to say. Monaspa, probably bottom of S tier. Do I put them over Huskarls? So Monaspa used to basically be the best unit in the game before they got nerfed. Now I actually think they're underrated because the Georgian late game with Monaspa is still absolutely terrifying. They're still one of the best unique units in the game. That said, they don't feel quite as overbearing as the Leitis does in most situations, but they're still nice and quick to get going, which is like they're cheap, they're pretty easy to mass, they have really good armor, fast speed, high attack, and there isn't really much more you could want from a cavalry unit in the late game, and you almost always want to go Monaspas if you have the ability to do so with Georgians as a cav unit. I mean, Georgians can also go infantry siege, but yeah, Monaspa still very much feel like one of the best units in the game. You can work them in early Castle Age, you can work them in post-imp, and everywhere in between, which is nice. Mounted Trebuchets. They're a fun unit, but they're basically not as good bombard cannons, but they're also attached to a civilization that doesn't have bombard cannons. So there certainly is a place for it. Like, they fill a really important niche for the Khitans, but I don't really think that we can put them above maybe... I'll put them here. I think that's a fair spot for the Mounted Trebuchet. I like to see these guys become a bit cheaper, because I do think it's a fun unit. They're fast, and they're actually pretty well armored for a siege unit. But, yeah, I mean, it's not really the most exciting unit in the world. Obuk. An interesting one. It definitely feels like it should be somewhere around here. Yeah, that feels pretty fair. It's a really solid all-around tanky unit for the Poles in the late game, but the Poles aren't really defined by them. You know, Winged Hussars, Block to Privileged Knights, those are the sorts of things that Poles typically spam. But anytime you run into like a lot of Halbs, or if you're just sort of needing that tanky frontline unit, Obuk are really good at that. Like, they are a very strong all-around unit. There's a reason they haven't really had any balance changes associated with them as far as I can remember, just because they were added to the game, they fill a unique role for the civilization, and they even strip the armor of enemy units so that your ranged support units are also going to still be effective. So, good all-around unit, but nothing that is going to be too game-deciding in general. Organ guns. Organ guns are kind of like Hussite wagons, except not quite as good in early Castle Age, but even better in post-amp. Maybe here, because they still have their weaknesses to mangonels, although Portuguese in Castle Age can deal with that weakness by monks, which are cheap, and in late game they can deal with it with their very strong bombard cannons, and a giant mass of organ guns is one of the most oppressive things to face in Imperial Age. So, thankfully, I guess the unit didn't get that Castle Age nerf, because it never had its range reduced to 6, which maybe if you're thinking that patch went through, it did not. So they still have 7 range in Castle Age. They're still exceptionally powerful, low eco, and even high eco, like organ guns, bombard cannons, halbs, and bombard towers is just one of the most oppressive things in all of AoE2, especially with the Faderias. So yeah, they still very much feel like an S tier unit. Probably around here is fine. Plumes. They do fill an important niche in the Mayan tech tree, in that they're still going to be a population-efficient archer, and they're faster and tankier than regular archers. maybe around here. They also have a little bit of bonus damage versus infantry, which is nice. And yet they still have 5 attack. It's not like they're the most amazing unit in the world. Mayan's very much a tempo-oriented civ, and Plumed Archers can help close out a game. And they still represent your best late-game unit alongside Eldorado Eagle Warriors. But it's still a bit more situational. Is it? I mean, Plumes are pretty good. The advantage that Plumes give you over Arbs is probably a little bit less than the advantage that Kameyuks give you over Halbs, for instance. So I think it's all pretty close here. And if you're like, oh my god, Ornlu, the Plumed Archer should be 3 spots higher and the Kameyuk 1 spot lower, like, that doesn't really matter that much. It's all kind of ballparking this. And it's just kind of a fun discussion to have. Ratha, still an S-tier unit, probably. They define the Bengalis in mid-game. They can still get countered in the late game, but it's a really annoying unit to deal with. It has a lot of flexibility with the mode switching. They're not that expensive. They're a unit that you can kind of make work with both low upgrades, and they have a ton of upgrades you can play with anyway. Still think I might put them maybe here is fine. Very, very powerful unit for the Bengalis. You don't need to go for them in every game, but Rathas are... There's a reason Bengalis are one of the best civs in the game in general, right? And the Rathas are no small part of that. Rattan Archers. Ooh. A very, very tanky archer. They're kind of like Genoese crossbowmen in that they are your late-game archer option of choice in general over arbalests. They also just happen to counter most other archers and ranged units as well, so I think I'm going to put them here. Rattan archers are super good. Again, Vietnamese, one of the best civilizations in the game. Imp skirms and Rattan archers do have some overlapping roles. Imp skirms, though, being the trash unit, and Rattans being the gold-intensive version. But yeah, that feels like a pretty good spot for Rattans. Samurai! Great late-game unit for the Japanese, but not really one that defines the civilization, which is usually Cav Archers and Halbs these days. Samurai are still very good, though, but they also don't fulfill a ton of roles that champions don't, as their bonus damage versus other unique units is, generally speaking, not that important. But it's still a very strong unit overall, so I'm not going to sit here and say that Samurai are bad. Yeah, I still think they're a B-tier unit. Savars! I mean, it's like, how good is a Paladin? Paladins are pretty good. They're basically a slightly better version of Paladins. You make them from the stable. Persian Eco is fantastic. They still have all the same weaknesses that Paladins do. And in the late game, they still lack the cost efficiency. Like, I still think Monaspa are probably a bit better because they're so cheap. But yeah, I mean, they're Paladins that are even better against Archers and basically the same versus most other units. So still a very, very strong unit overall for the Persians. Sergeant! Oh boy. I mean, it's like you can make them in Feudal Age, and then in Castle Age, and in Imperial Age. It makes the unit really tough to rank. The instant Castle Age upgrades are really good for the unit. Somewhere in the middle of B tier feels appropriate, I think. Because Sicilians are pretty Sergeant-based in the late game, but they're also Sergeant-based in the early game as well. So maybe somewhere-ish around here is pretty good. Like, it's one of those very difficult unique units to rank, though, because you can see them in different ways at different stages of the game. But yeah, Sicilians are certainly a civ that are pretty reliant on the Sergeant, although not completely so, and Sergeants themselves aren't usually like the back-breaking unit, except in early Castle Age. Showtells, definitely like a lower C-tier unit. They still represent the very high melee damage option for Ethiopians, who otherwise mostly deal pierce damage with their archers and stuff. So in that sense, they're actually really good, and Royal Heirs is kind of an underrated tech, as it just makes Showtells eat through the light cav line and camels, and even helps out a lot versus cav archers. But it's still a situational unit, it's still quite expensive, and Ethiopians can play an entire game and not make Showtells, and still win in a lot of different situations. So in that sense, I think that Showtells are probably somewhere around here. Oh boy, Shrivamsha Riders. They definitely fill a very unique role in the Gurjara tech tree. I might put them here. I mean, like, they're still a pretty decent all-around unit, but they don't have quite the late-game punch that, you know, Chakrams do. It's such an annoying unit to deal with in a lot of cases, but with Gurjaras, it's not just Shrivamsha Riders, right? It's that the Shrivamsha Riders exist in the context of Gurjaras with other very strong counter units and no knight whatsoever. So I think somewhere around there is good for the Shrivamsha. And this list is getting gigantic. Slingers, in the family of units that are extremely good in their specific situation, but otherwise you don't really make them that much. Yeah, somewhere around here. Again, if you're up against infantry, make slingers. Oftentimes, players will want to make infantry against Incas because Incas are making a lot of Eagle Warriors. So the situation in which you want to make slingers does rise pretty often, but it's still, again, it's a situational unit. I'm gonna have to zoom this out. Sun Jian. Faster movement speed is always really nice to have, and the Wu armies can benefit a lot from it. It's going to make your infantry faster, archers faster, cav faster. I mean, all of those things are very, very good to have. Thing which is better between Liu Bei and Sun Jian feels like kind of a pointless discussion. Just gonna put him there, whatever. Heroes are not really worth it most of the time. Harkins fills a unique role, but doesn't necessarily compete with paladins in a lot of ways. They have gotten buffed several times now, though, so they're pretty decent. I mean, they're still strong against archers and against buildings, which is a nice combo in the Hun tech tree. I think that's a pretty good spot for them. Again, Tarkins used to be a very bad unit, and the fact that they're even like a mid-B tier unique unit, in my opinion, now is very nice. Oh, Teutonic Knights. As much as we love them and wish they were an S tier, they are simply not. They're still like your best late game, all-around tanky unit for your slow push, and that does lean into the Teuton playstyle quite well. And they are a significant upgrade over champions in the actual melee combat, so honestly, I think they might go here. They're not as bad as you probably think they are, because their stats, again, are very, very strong in close combat. But oftentimes, if you want a melee unit, you want an explicitly anti-cav unit, which is where the halbs come in, so it's kind of tough. Taxmen! They did just get buffed, so it's kind of hard to say exactly. They do feel like a pretty decent unit overall, but Franks have hand cannoneers, and they generally fill the same role, and hand cannons are much easier to get to. So I think we'll probably put them at the bottom of B tier, but with the caveat that we haven't fully tested out the buffs yet to the throwing axemen, so we'll have to, I think, see just how much better they are with that extra range. This could certainly move up over time. Theosadai, D tier. It's basically caravels, but they're even more situational, as they're very expensive to get going. They are a very population-efficient unit, but they also don't quite have the damage that caravels do in big masses. Same weakness caravels, they're terrible against fire ships, and you run into a lot of fire ships in the late game. So it's kind of a tough unit to justify in a lot of cases. Tiger Cavalry. That does feel like it might be somewhere around here. They can be very expensive, but they are sort of your paladin replacement for the Wei. And they are very good against archers as well. So maybe top of B tier should be good for the unit. It still is quite easily countered by anti-cavalry options, but it's kind of like a Tarkin, but with better combat stats, while obviously not being as good against buildings. But it's still going to be a pretty good unit all around. This video is getting long, so I'm trying to speed through this more towards the end here. Turtle ships. They just got reworked. Like, last patch, they were like the worst unit in the game. You never wanted to make them. If they're good against fire ships now... Alright, whoops, I hit the wrong button on accident. Yeah, turtle ships somewhere around here. They are going to be good, I think, again, in Castle Age versus fire ships. A little bit worse in the late game versus galleons, but that's where your own galleons can come in as a support option. They're still very expensive to get going, and oftentimes you'd rather just make fire ships and galleons, but at least they should have their role in the game again, which is kind of what you wanted to see for the unit. Winged Hussars. This is the only unique unit that isn't actually unique because it's available to 2 civilizations. For some reason, the game does consider them a unique unit. Like, pole Winged Hussars are an S tier unit with the trample damage and the pole eco. Lithuanians are probably an A tier unit. Again, it's really weird because it's available to 2 civilizations. I feel like we can just kind of slap them somewhere over here near the Imp Skirms as like your really good trash units, and that's probably fine. Urumi are like the prototypical low C tier unique unit. They're amazing in melee combat, but just drop like flies to anything ranged. It's a really tricky unit to balance, but overall, it's pretty bad these days. It's not a very important at all for the Dravidians. So maybe even the bottom of C tier, just because it's so weak to ranged units. That seems about right. Warrior Priests do fill a very unique role, but you don't typically want to make more than a few of them, as you want to transition into the regular swordsman line with Armenians throughout the game. But again, the fact that they can go pick up relics and just give you that relic advantage does make them very useful, although not really your typical long-term combat option. Yeah, it's just more of a utility unit, and it functions well in that role, so I think we're going to put it here overall. The Chariot of War! Who knows, man? It just got nerfed. It's still pretty decent against feudal age units, but it's also really, really bad in the late game. And it's still probably not as good as Hussite wagons in that regard, so maybe somewhere around here for the War Chariot. Again, really good in the all-in, but that's also been nerfed, so they're just kind of okay-ish units until late game now. War Elephants! Yeah, that feels pretty good. It's a very situational unit, but it's also incredible in that one situation, which is post-imp with gold. Lots of gold. So it's like, if you're ever getting to war elephants, yeah, they can be insane, but that whole situation comes about so rarely that it's not really a unit that you get to see very often. War wagons. Again, this feels like a solid A tier unit. It can be good in early Castle Age. It can be good in post-Imperial Age. It is expensive, though, and difficult to replace for a civ that doesn't have an eco bonus. I still really like the unit overall. I think here is going to be a good spot for him. White Feather Guards are sort of like your stock standard infantry unique unit. They're good tanks, but they don't really do a whole lot when it comes to dealing damage. It's still a really important unit for the Shu, but it's just not that strong of a unit overall. Woadies, very, very good in the late game. So it feels like Longbowmen, Woads, Yukonu Jaguars, Magyar Hussars. Like, all of these units are really, really good late game, but oftentimes you're not really able to get there. That said, Woads are still a very good unit overall. And last but not least, oh my goodness, Xianbei Raiders. So Xianbei, let's put them near Kipchaks, the unit that they're a clone of. Xianbei are a bit easier to get going, and so they're probably a little bit more useful overall than Kipchaks are, but yeah, it's not a very good Cav Archer, but they are pretty cheap, and they're easy to mass, and Wei have a very good eco. Alright, so is there anything we really want to change here? S tier looks pretty good to me. A tier, probably overrated. Gebetto's a little bit here. I think Shrivamsha probably should be B tier. Imp Camels, pretty good. I think I underrate relative to the other units. Longbowmen, Woad Raiders, Yukonu, Jags, Magyar Hussars. Yeah, this looks a little bit better for B tier. This could also be my AOC bias showing, who knows. C tier is looking pretty decent, if I say so myself. And D tier is pretty sad, as always. So, if I did this list tomorrow, guys, I'm sure it would completely change and I'd move a ton of stuff around again. But for today, as I'm recording this August 31st, 2025, this is my unique units tier list in AoE2. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, shout out to my Patreon supporters with Dan and Jared in the Great Wolf tier, and then Carolyn, Dieter, Liquid Egg Product, Hryru, and Tandoori Knight in the Dire Wolf tier. But thank you guys all so much for watching. Hope you had fun, and I'll see you guys next time.